All right, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're having a fantastic Saturday. I'm so glad that you guys are with us. And today we've got an exciting topic to talk about, which is BRRRR for apartment buildings. I know that there's been a lot of terminology about what BRRRR is, and many investors who are starting out understand that it's a very popular strategy, and for good reason as well. This strategy is something that allows you to get your money into apartment complexes or into single family homes, apply it and find the best and highest use, and then take a lot of your original seed money back out so you can eventually go and repeat the process over in general. So what I want to do is I want to start by explaining what the BRRRR process is overall in general and using it in the context of a single family house. And then we can start to talk about how useful it is and what the differences are between the single family and then also heading into multifamily with the same idea. Okay. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen real quick. So you should be able to see. Give me 1 second here. All right, so there you go. You should be able to see in general, when you look to buy a property, right? Let's say for a single family, you're going to find a property that's worth that's going to be worth $135,000 based on what all of the comps in that neighborhood are going for. And you're able to locate a deal and find the property that is distressed, needs some work. And so it's $75,000 to purchase. And after talking with your contractor or your property manager, you're finding that it's about $20,000 worth of rehab, and there's a contingency of $5,000. What this means is that as your projections go during this first B or the buy process, right? You screen the property and you find out that it's going to cost you $75,000 to get it. It's going to take $25,000 to get it fixed up. Plus that's with your contingency included in there. And then you can sell it for $135,000, which means that your sale profit should be around $35,000. Okay, that's the fundamentals, and let's see how that plays out. So that's the B part of the process. The next part is rehab. This is the biggest part of the job. This is what takes usually the longest and where most of the stress is when in the process. And this is where a lot of the value is added too. So a lot of information just came up on the screen, but basically what we're doing here is we're visualizing what our projections were. We have the $75,000 worth of purchase equity right here on the screen. And then there's the $25,000 rehab contingency budget. And then there's the $35,000 of profit. Okay. And that's what comprises the $135,000 ARV. And here is just some math about showing you what that means, just kind of recalculating what we just knew and what we just spoke through, right? This means that on a $135,000 house, you should have $100,000 of your own money all into this, right? Which means that, let's say that everything goes according to plan. That is the first R, that is the rehab. And then the next R is renters. Because in this key instance, what you want to do is get renters in there so that they can start paying for some of the rehab that you've done in terms of rental income, because you're going to need that rental income to pay the mortgage, which you're about to do when you do a refinance. Okay. So essentially what you're doing now is you're taking all of the original properties seed investment, which is the $100,000 that you put into it, and you're converting that to debt by asking a bank to please, write me a loan on this property. And if you're able to get 75% loan to value, which is usually what you could get, the bank doesn't care how you got there, right? All they know is that the property is worth $135,000 and there's no loan on it. So they're willing to loan money to you because they'll make interest off of it. So once you do that, you take the $100,000, right, as a loan, and that goes to you as the owner, and you have to pay that back in terms of in the form of a mortgage payment, which your resident is paying on your behalf. Okay. And so here's some math about how that works out. But basically, when all the dust clears and all the smoke clears, you have $75,000 in for buying the property plus $25,000 for the rehab if everything went according to plan. Then if you do this right, you'll be able to end up with slightly more cash than when you started. But after all the dust clears, you have one property that's cash flowing and that's in your portfolio. And then, of course, the last piece of the BRRRR equation is repeating the whole thing over and over again. So you can see how sustainable this would be, especially if you're in a market or you find properties of such high quality and such high margin that you can keep doing this over and over again without having to dip into your own personal pocket, so to speak, right? And the great thing is that every time you do this and you do refinance, it's not a taxable event, because a refinance is just taking a loan out. It's an IOU, so you don't have to pay any taxes on the money that you're pulling out of the refinance. If you eventually sell the property, then that's a different story. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can approach that, but that's the BRRRR process in general. And I wanted to spend some time just to make sure that everyone understood what that was, because that's kind of the basis of our discussion going forward in single family and in multifamily. So I'm going to get rid of that. So let's talk about the difference between single family, multifamily. Okay. So first of all, as usual, in multifamily, financing is just a little bit more complicated, especially on the buy, because when you're going to be buying a multifamily property, unless you have a lot of cash or you have deep pockets or you've got private money or partners, you're going to have to use some sort of financing in order to get a loan on the property in the first place. And generally, banks don't like to lend to that type of investment, because if there's a lot of hairy stuff going on there, banks like to have the property itself as collateral. And so oftentimes, if it's a small multifamily property like the one that we purchased, and I'm going to tell you about how that all ended out later on, but if you purchase a property like that, they're going to want a personal guarantee, which means you have to sign on to the debt personally to make sure that you can make the payment in case something goes wrong with it. Okay. So if the property is big enough or too big and it's under a lot of distress, then you may not be able to shoulder that burden. And so the financing gets complicated and expensive, because again, these banks like to have the value of the property itself that you're putting the loan on as collateral, right? But if the property is in decline, then they might not want to do that. If they don't trust you to be able to do the work, then they might not give you a loan, or the loan will be very expensive and have some terms that may not work out in your favor. Okay. But don't let that discourage you, because sometimes you can start small and organically and use your own personal income as like a recourse, as collateral, just in case. And then that way banks will be willing to lend to you. But in single family, it's different, because it's just the house and it's the appraisal, and you're buying it cash outright at the beginning, so there's no real bank involved until you get to the end product. Okay. But usually in multifamily, you're going to want a bank involved to help you with the rehab, because it's usually bigger numbers that you're dealing with. So you'll want to have financing in place when you're purchasing. And generally, we like to do bridge loans, which are only like 2-3 years of duration at a higher interest rate, with the end goal of refinancing in mind, just like what we're planning on here. Another thing that you have to keep in mind too while doing a BRRRR on an apartment building is tenant management. So it's a little bit different for the single family. In single family, when you start off, usually the property in distress is either not fit for someone to live there, or there's no one in it. So you can just go in and just rehab the thing, and as quick as you can go through the rehab, that's no problem. But with single families, if you have a systematic problem, like let's say that you have a plumbing issue or an electrical issue that runs through all of the units, well, in order to do that, you got to work around people that are already in the property, especially if it's occupied and you're taking it over with distress. If there are people in there that want to stay there while the whole thing is going on, you're going to have to manage that with your property manager while the individual units are getting turned around. And there's also common components like hallways, parking lots and things like that can be a general nuisance to people that are still in the property. So it's a plus and a minus, right? You don't have the ability most times to be able to go in and just rip everything out, right? From the beginning. But because there's people there, they should be paying rent, which means you should be getting some sort of income while you're doing the rehabs. And usually on single family houses, that's kind of a difference. You don't really have that, because you're kind of like tearing it down to the studs and kind of bringing things back up. Okay. So that's a little bit of a difference you have to be mindful of, is like what are going to happen with your tenants as you're working on certain scopes of work. And it can be as simple as just, going in and going to each unit and replacing all of the components in one unit as people leave. That's obviously the preferred route, but then it's a matter of speed. Like how much time do you have with your recourse debt, with your bridge loan? And so you got to kind of play that out on the BRRRR side for bigger multifamily apartments. The next thing is filling vacancies. So on the BRRRRs for apartment buildings, as I was just mentioning, as units are done, you can put people in as long as you've worked on all the common components. So if you lay out your plan in that way, right, where you have all the plumbing and electrical, rehab and roofing or whatever that affects all of the units first, you get that done first. Then you can start working on individual units. And as the units are completed, you can bring people in and start collecting the higher income for those rehab units right from the beginning. Whereas on a single family home, you have to wait for the whole rehab to be done on everything. And then you can finally get someone in there and do it. So having the ability to like have the economies of scale by having your contractor work on 3 or 4 units at one time, or focusing on 1 unit at a time, right? With the guaranteed work that's lined up for the next one, they can bring more resources on site and usually finish rehabs quicker, okay? Now on the rehab, and that we already covered the differences on the buy side. We've covered the differences on the rehab and the rent. Now let's talk about the refinance and the exit piece of this, right? On a multifamily versus single family. So on a single family home, it was as simple as what we just discussed or what we showed on the screen before. You have your cash in the property or some sort of hard money or something like that that's either not your cash or that's borrowed, that you should be able to get a government loan, a single family loan onto it based on the appraisal that you end up getting. And if you did your homework right, then that's good. Then it's easy. They put a loan in place and that encumbers the entire property and you're on your merry way and you're doing the repeat to the next one. Okay. But in the multifamily space though, it's a little bit more complicated as usual because the financing is based on the net operating income of the building that's in place, right? So as your rehabs are completing, right, your net operating income is increasing a little bit each time that you do a unit turn and you have people paying rent. Once you have it fully occupied, right, and that could take anywhere between 1 year to 2 years, right, depending on how big the property is and what your resources are and how quickly and how aggressive you want to grow. Once you hit that point, then you can start entering conversations with the bank. They'll do their appraisal, right? They'll look at your financials and they'll see what it is that they can write a loan for you for. And in general, if it's more stabilized, you're showing like a 90% occupancy rate or higher, and it's at a good net operating income level that's over and above what you paid for it, plus the rehab, then they'll be happy to do the exact same thing that you have with the single families. They'll just write you the loan based on the new NOI and the debt service coverage ratio. That's a very important topic because debt service coverage ratio doesn't really come up too much in single families, because on single families, your recourse and you have your own personal income or whatever the entity that's buying it, that's the recourse payer in case the loan defaults. So, but on these multifamily properties, whatever your debt service coverage ratio is, usually about 1.25 to 1.3, is where banks will start to cut you off and say, well, we're only going to lend to you based on the coverage of the income coming in versus the debt payments that we can write you. Okay. So that's something just to keep in mind when it comes to those apartment buildings. So with that being the case, we kind of covered all the differences between single family and multifamily throughout the whole process of BRRRR. Now I want to share with you guys like what the end result was in my particular case and how this all went down. My partners and I, we bought an 18-unit multiplex in Indianapolis, and it needed a complete gut. Obviously, we didn't anticipate it to need as much as it did, so that was some other problem that we worked through. But we purchased 18 units for about $350,000 total just on the acquisition. And our plan was to take out a loan on the $350,000 that we put in to use as a rehab budget, right? So we ended up doing that and we blew through all of that. We had issues with our contractors and we had issues with property management and a bunch of different things. And eventually we finally got the ship turned around. It was a very long process. It took us about actually 1 year to 1.5 years to get all the units turned around and all the units leased up and to a place where we could tell a bank, okay, we are now fully leased. We have a new established net operating income. We're ready for a loan. And once we did that, I think our total loan amount was, we went in for $350 to purchase it. And then our rehab costs were somewhere around $800K. So our all in was somewhere around 1.1 in that realm. And then we ended up getting a bank loan out at 1.4. And so that was the total value that that was the appraisal. So they lent us out about 1 to 1.1. So we were able to get most of our original capital back out, plus pay off all the investors that we had to keep as a seed in the property. So that was a very successful BRRRR that we did. And of course, I've done some on the single family side where I ended up with more money than I started in the beginning. So I would recommend that most people starting out doing BRRRR should try to do that on the single family side to make sure that it works, because there's a lot of moving pieces. And as usual, when you start getting involved in multifamily, there's a little bit more components to it that add to the complexity and make it even more difficult to be able to do. But the strategy still applies and it still does work. And I have proof that it does work because we've done it. So anyway, that is BRRRR for apartment buildings and the differences between apartments and single family. I hope that that was useful for you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I really appreciate talking to you personally. If there's anything else that you want to ask, please engage us in the comments wherever you're watching this or listening to this. We really do appreciate that. And we will enjoy adding more value to you guys in the future. So please let us know what you want to see and how you like this. And looking forward to adding more value later on. So hope you have a fantastic weekend. And thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. Take care.